Thank you for joining us for our Racial Justice Learning Series. We're so glad you're here. My name is Molly Blau-Gillis. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm Chief Communications Officer at General Catalyst. We'd like to begin with some important acknowledgements. First, yesterday marked the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. The senseless murder of George Floyd was a catalyst for many of us to take action against racism and violence in this country. Unfortunately, the last few weeks have been marked yet again by horrific hate and violence. And so today, we hold space for the victims and their families of these most recent tragedies, including those in Buffalo and Uvalde. As a nation, we must commit to change and to preventing senseless, barbaric acts of violence from occurring. It's difficult during times like these to remember what connects us as a society, humanity. The belief that there are more people in the world who strive to do the right thing than not, and that each of us has the ability to make a difference. Yes, broadly, but also and importantly for each other. At this moment, when words are not sufficient to describe our sense of loss, anger, and sadness, we invite you to join us together in a moment of silence. Thank you. Last year, General Catalyst launched this learning series with renowned leaders to foster conversation, collective learning, and action relating to race, racial justice, and equity. We are thrilled to continue this spring with sessions focused on the Asian American Pacific Islander experience, beginning with the history, which we'll focus on today with Theo Gonzalves. Personally, as an Asian American Latina, it's been an incredible journey developing this series with Theo and my colleague, Arumli Lansel. The past 2 years in particular have been painful for the extended Asian American Pacific Islander community. Asian hate and violence and racism towards AAPIs has escalated. It's scary, it's wrong, and it's heartbreaking. There also have been moments of pride as the extended AAPI community has come together in solidarity and resistance, themes that Theo teaches us to look for and be present to. That very solidarity and resistance has persevered throughout our Asian American Pacific Islander history. I must admit, when first speaking with Theo and others, I was embarrassed by how little I knew. This series, and in particular, our many conversations with Theo to prepare, have inspired me to learn more about AAPI history and my own family lineage, and to be able to see and understand the relationship between them. I was reminded of a quote from Yo-Yo Ma: "When you learn something from people or from a culture, you accept it as a gift, and it is your lifelong commitment to preserve it and build on it." I've learned so much and remain curious about so much still. It's a gift to be able to share the knowledge, experience, activism, and inspiration of these incredible leaders and lifelong learners with all of you. Our series continues in June and again in September. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. Closed captioning as well as a live transcript are available for those who are interested. And please do ask questions via the Q&A function. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Theo Gonzalves. Theo is a scholar of comparative cultural studies, currently a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He also served as interim director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Theo is a published author many times over. He's a Fulbright scholar and has been a research fellow at the Smithsonian Institution and the Library of Congress. An accomplished musician, performer, and composer, he has written, produced, and performed several scores for independent films. Please join me in warmly welcoming Theo. And Theo, truly, thank you for being here with us today and for sharing your many gifts.
Thank you, Molly, for that really generous introduction. And thank you as well to Arum for helping to set up this series. I'm really excited to be with you today. And as we get started with what are the closing days of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I'd also like for us to consider what that means to extend our learning throughout the rest of the year. Thankfully, we don't, those of us of Asian Pacific American heritage don't just live just in the month of May. We live full lives, and we want to communicate the fullness of our humanity every day of the year, wherever we are. So again, to all of you at General Catalyst for this invitation, I'm very humbled by the invitation to be with you today. I'm going to share with you some slides just to keep things lively here. I hope you can see that. And hopefully we haven't had any mishaps so far. Okay, I think we're good. And as I said, this close of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is a way to reflect on the lineage of celebration and history that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have put down over centuries, from coast to island, territory to territory. And we are dealing, I think, with some very challenging moments in the present, not only with the African American community and Latino communities in Buffalo and in Uvalde, but I'd also be remiss if we didn't mention the shooting death that occurred in Laguna Woods in my home state of California. It seems to be an ever-present situation of violence and race, ethnicity, and place and power. And so we are trying to find ways to make sense out of all this. And I think one way to do that is to find connection to each other. And I think that's probably the only way to do this, is to remain connected to each other and to explore each other's histories and stories, personally, biographically, but also historically. And so I'm happy to join you from the Smithsonian Institution. I'm here in Washington, D.C. This isn't personally where I work, but it's one of the places that I used to love to go to on those lunch breaks, at the National Portrait Museum and the Smithsonian Asian American Art Museum. Just a brief note about the Smithsonian. It is one institution. It's the world's largest research, education, and museum complex. But it is also many institutions. And in that sense, it contains 21 museums, 2 of which are brand new. The National Museum of the American Latino, Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, 2 of which have been approved by Congress within the last year. And those 2 are on their way for a decade-long march for construction. But in all, we have 21 museums at the Smithsonian, 9 research centers, and 1 zoo, the National Zoo. And all of that falls into the grand universe of what we do at the Smithsonian. Personally, I work at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, which was founded in 1964. It started out as a history museum of science, of American science. So you can imagine the heady days of the space program, and what the promise of what technology meant for American culture. Since the 1960s, this museum has expanded into social, cultural, and labor history. So it's really quite an amazing place, and it's open to the public, as are all of the Smithsonian units. So I hope you can get a chance to come and visit. I want to explain a little bit about some of my work at the Smithsonian as a curator. It is a specific occupational category. Before that, I worked as an Asian American Studies professor in California and Maryland and Hawaii. And I did that for about 26 years. And I hated it so much that I did it for that long. But what I did was I brought those skill sets over from Asian American Studies and working as a college professor into the work of being a curator. And I think when we think about that term, oftentimes we have a sense of what a curator does. They're usually putting their hands on objects, although usually they would probably wear latex gloves. So maybe this person is maybe not a curator, but you've seen what curators do, I guess, in popular culture. If you're a fan of Scandal, of course, you've probably seen Papa Pope use his cover. He was always working at the Smithsonian, but we knew he was really doing something else. In Black Panther, we understand what was about to happen here, and having this interesting discussion about provenance and where artifacts usually begin. That's the Hollywood version of what it means to be a curator. And what I want to do is to identify the 4 areas of curatorial work that I am engaged in. And it involves these areas: research, collections, engagement. Engagement involves exhibitions and programming. And then, of course, service, not only to the academy, not only to the profession of curatorial work, but also to the community and to the general public. So I'll focus just on one aspect of this, which is the collections work that I do. And I focus on 2 areas of work, not only on Asian Pacific American history, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I also work on culture and the performing arts. So I have a background in music and theater and film, and that's allowed me to think critically about the history of American performance. And one of the things I was able to collect recently was were some objects that belonged to Lester Young, a fantastic tenor saxophonist, born 1909, passed away in 1959. He had played with Billie Holiday and Count Basie. And we were able to do is I was able to collect his saxophone, his tenor saxophone, and metal clarinet, and that beautiful pork pie hat. So one thing that you know about Lester Young is that he wasn't just about the music. He also had a particular way of speaking. In fact, many of the words we use today in terms of American slang come from his popularization of some of these words. This is Lester Young's son, who came to the museum, and along with our director there, Dr. Anthea Hartig, in a donation ceremony just right before the pandemic started. And so we were able to put together this public program where we were able to acknowledge the family donation to the National Museum of American History, so we can continue to tell this long story about Black genius and African-American jazz for forever, really. I mean, that's our charge. So that's one side of my job that pertains to culture and performing arts. The other side pertains to Asian Pacific America, broadly speaking. And so I've been able to collect a couple of things from Naomi Osaka, the tennis superstar, who in 2020 won the US Open. You might remember in the finals of that match, she wore 7 masks that each was emblazoned with the name of a person who was killed in police detention. And so we have here, she was able to donate the tennis racket from that match, but then also all 7 of these masks that are going to be part of the Smithsonian's collection. So I'm really proud of this collection, because what it does is it allows us to link other parts of the collection with Naomi Osaka and with 2020, and specifically with George Floyd and many of these other stories that need to be told. So I think some of the best objects in many ways tell more than one kind of story, and certainly that's true in this case. We have the robe and boxing gloves and the trunks of Muhammad Ali. So in many ways, yes, that is a story about one of the 20th century's most impactful boxers and sports celebrities. But he was also someone who refused service in the Vietnam War, and as a result had been stripped of his title and was not allowed to work professionally for several years. So this gives us an opportunity to ask the question, what do you do with the platform that you have? And whether it's Muhammad Ali or Naomi Osaka, there are sports celebrities that have used their platform to speak on any number of issues. And so again, we get a chance to tell that particular story with these humble objects. And so it's our humble duty to be able to share that with you. I've been collecting as well in some of these areas of popular culture. There's a Filipina rapper by the name of Ruby Ibarra, and I collected her jacket that on the back of it says, these are lyrics from one of her songs. And she's rapping not only in English and in Tagalog, which is the 4th most commonly spoken language in the United States, but these lyrics come from one of her songs, and it reads, "Island women rise, walang makakatigil," which means nothing can stop us. Brown women, nothing on us. And so again, this humble jacket allows us to tell a story about hip hop, and specifically what a young Filipina immigrant woman has to say about her place in the world and what feminism means in the life of a young Filipina. I also reached out to Ali Wong, and the comedian who several years ago in a special called Baby Cobra had popularized this particular dress. You might have seen it later that Halloween when a number of people started wearing their version of the dress for different Halloween parties. She graciously donated not only this dress, which is like an H&M dress, it's about $8 really. This dress, those shoes, and then also her necklace. She donated the outfit to us, and we'll be featuring it in an upcoming exhibit on entertainment. So, you might ask, what's my long career as being an academic has now come to collecting dresses and jackets and masks, but they all add up to telling the larger history, I think, of the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience. And so what I want to do is to use this latest acquisition that just a few weeks ago, and I want to focus on this with you, if you will. It is a banner that measures about 12 feet by 4 feet, And it's a banner that was created by an organization for a march and a rally that took place in San Francisco, Chinatown on February 29, 2020. So imagine that date, recall that date if you can. That's 11 days before the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus a global pandemic. And on that day, February 29, 2020, this group assembled 1,000 people for a march in San Francisco, Chinatown. And what caught my attention was, of course, what that would mean for the Asian American and Chinese American communities specifically. But this banner caught my attention because the text of the banner reads, "Fight the virus, not the people." In the Chinese language, there are two other lines that talk about supporting the businesses of Chinatown, stopping discrimination. And then there's a little bit at the end that translates loosely to "add oil," which I learned later was an idiomatic expression that amounts to "with courage and determination," which is, put your back into it, as it were. So this message caught my attention because, everything that was stated at that rally, and there was an hours-long rally in San Francisco by these organizers, everything that was stated and the hopes and the fears, mostly the fears of what was to take place, all of those actually ended up taking place. People ended up not necessarily fighting the virus, they ended up fighting the people. And that Asian Americans, specifically Chinese Americans, became the targets of discrimination, and businesses were closing. Many people were losing their livelihoods. And then I thought, well, February 29, this is before the pandemic was declared. I asked the question to myself, how is it possible that they could see into the future? How could they know what was about to happen? And the truth is, it wasn't about foresight. It was more than that. It was hindsight. And the truth is, this organization, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, was founded in 1882, as it were. And that was also the same year as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so what became important to me was that I was asking the wrong question. It's not about the fact that they were able to tell the future. They were armed with the lessons of the past. These are hard-headed lessons. And again, we are remiss if we do not know these lessons. And I don't think any of us have any need to feel embarrassed about not knowing any of these histories. Sometimes they're actually being kept from us. And the truth is, there's never a wrong time to learn this. So I'm inviting all of us to think about what this banner means for not only anticipating the future, but also meeting the present, which is how does a community meet the present when they're about to face unimaginable violence? But the truth is they met it with history. And so what I'd like to do is to use this banner to think about what that means for Asian American history, to explore the origin story of some of our experiences in the United States. So if we think about that time period of 1882, certainly it's the case that we have other artifacts in the museum that pertain to that time period. And it was really quite a vicious time period if you consider 1870s. This is a toy pistol made of iron. And you imagine these were sold as toys to hobbyists. And it's the picture of a white person kicking the rear end of a Chinese whose queue, the long queue, had been cut. And on the side of the gun, it says, "The Chinese must go." These were artifacts that have been collected as part of the National Museum of American History. Another one in our collection dating to 1880. It's a really odd one. It was made in New York City by the Union Porcelain Works. And if you look up the history of this country, they've made homeware and goods, pots and dishes and all kinds of interesting items for the home. But then they also sold this porcelain figure in 1880, which depicts a young white boy grabbing an American eagle, and they're sitting atop of nest. And you can see that young boy has his hand on what seems to be an African-American male. And then just outside of that nest is someone either who has fallen from the nest or seems to be trying to get their way back into it. But you can clearly see that is a person on the very bottom there who has a cue. And again, this is a story from 1980 of a Chinese person being thrown out of that nest. So it's possible for us to think about the horrors of that time, but I think that's really only part of the story of Asian Americans in the United States. And what I'm asking you to do is to consider the other part of the story that not only involves victimization and discrimination and violence, but we have to begin in a certain time and place that allows us to consider that Asian Americans were actively welcomed, if not recruited and attracted to the United States by the thousands. So it's not enough for us to say that Asian Americans began their history and then we begin this awful history of exclusion and violence. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had been welcomed by the United States, by capital. And if we frame this history over a 100-year time period, roughly from the 1840s to the 1940s, I think that gives us a sense of the broad scope of this early generation, essentially our ancestors, how they came to be. So I'm always fascinated by origin stories. And this is one particular origin story that I think we can assign to the Asian American experience, that capital at first welcomed Asians to the Americas. And then also there's another force that's pulling against it, which is nativists who attempt to create boundaries over who should be an American, who should and who should not be an American. So these are two competing forces, attraction and exclusion, or inclusion and exclusion. And this becomes a durable cycle for that century. So what I want to do is to kind of go through some of this history, because it allows us to see how certain groups came to the United States over that time period. So if we think about the 1840s, the discovery of gold in Placer County, like I said, I'm originally from Monterey, Fort Ord area. I was born in Fort Ord. And if you go up from Fort Ord, the Monterey Peninsula, over east to Placer County, so past Sacramento, what you'll find is the discovery of gold in the 1840s and the recruitment, the active recruitment of Chinese laborers to Placer County in 1848. At first a trickle, like a lot of times it's a trickle, but then it becomes a flood of workers to come in doing very dangerous extractive work to mine gold. It's not only just panning for gold as they are in these streams, but it's also sticking loads of dynamite into mountains and exploding whole parts of the landscape in order to find those veins of gold. Very dangerous work, and the importation of Chinese labor would also lead not only to gold mining, but also to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. So again, that active recruitment of Chinese labor to California was crucial. And it was, in many ways, for thousands of workers, it was a lucrative way to begin one's life. But we have to think then what that means for the intervening decades. After the 1840s, what happens in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s? What happens again is that after that initial attraction, you have nativists in California begin to see Chinese laborers as a threat. So here in this is a cartoon that was widely circulated at the time. You'll see words that are associated with the Chinese community in the United States. They're no longer welcomed, but are now being associated with bribery, robbery, immorality. And if you see in the center tentacle of that image, the words typhoid and smallpox. So this association with Asians with disease and virus has had a very long historical arc. And if that's the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, by 1882, what nativists are able to accomplish then is to be able to push the US Congress to enact a sweeping exclusion law in 1882. This is the first time that a federal law would ban the entry of a group to the United States based on ethnicity or national origin. So the run up to this in 1882 would be the exclusion of Chinese women in 1875. So again, just this time period from the 1840s to 1882, we could see how that one pattern of attraction and exclusion works. Notice how what that does is if you close off the spigot to Chinese labor, capital is still welcoming by the thousands Japanese labor to plantations and orchards in the territory of Hawaii, but also up and down the west coast of the United States. So now you have, again, the inclusion or the recruitment, the attraction of Japanese labor to these locations. Unfortunately, what happens? This is part of the usual cycle then, isn't it? We're now beginning to see this as a pattern. It didn't take long then for nativists to start making their claims about the nation as a whole, which is who belongs, who doesn't belong. This is, I mean, if we were in a classroom setting, I'd ask those of you that are here, where is this sign? Where did the sign take place? What year did it take place? And it was actually in 1923 in Hollywood, California. So imagine what we think we know about California at this time period. And a year later, what you have is Congress passing another exclusion law, which now effectively targets Japanese communities. So this is, again, a famous bill, the Reed-Johnson Act, which effectively excludes Japanese at this time period. Earlier, there's the Barred Asiatic Zone Act of 1917, which would affect South Asians. But I'm trying to keep track here on some major dates. So again, what are we seeing now? We're now seeing a pattern of not only the serialization of Asian labor coming to the United States, first Chinese welcomed, excluded, Japanese welcomed, now excluded. Well, what then happens is that capital still has that need for the recruitment of labor on these territories and in these states. And because the Philippines had become a colony of the United States in 1899 as a result of the end of the Spanish-American War, Filipinos could travel to the United States without a passport. So this is different from China and Japan because those were sovereign countries, and the people in transit needed visas. Here, Filipinos, because they were essentially a colony of the United States, they traveled under a different legal designation. They were US nationals, which meant that they were neither aliens nor citizens. But it meant that capital could facilitate their inclusion into the United States more easily. And so you have them coming by the thousands, especially after the exclusion of Japanese in 1924. You have them coming by the thousands. And by 1929, it becomes really dire for the Filipino community. This is 1930 in Stockton, California. So this is just right outside of Sacramento, about 40 minutes south of Sacramento proper, where there was one of the largest Filipino communities, a hub of Filipino migration, and it's a club that's bombed. These are social gathering halls where people would come to share each other's company because it's a formerly segregated country. And so this is the other part of the railroad tracks, if you will. And as a result, that nativist ire would rise to the surface and be expressed in some really deadly violence. So what happens then is that, of course, that initial welcoming of Filipinos as a result of what capital needed would result in another kind of exclusion law. Now, this was billed as an independence bill for the Philippines because it had been taken as a colony. But what it was really was another way to exclude a large group of people from Asians from the United States. So following in the same footsteps of 1882, 1917, 1924, the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934 that was passed was a de facto exclusion bill, and it reduced the amount of Filipino migration from thousands to 50 a year. So you can imagine what that meant. These series of attitudes in the United States, this was popularized by a writer by the name of Carlos Bulosan, who wrote in his book, America's in the Heart, it was now the year of the great hatred, where the lives of Filipinos were cheaper than those of dogs. He wrote this nearly 80 years ago, but I think you could substitute Chinese, Japanese, even South Asians and others for Filipinos here, because this is now a durable pattern for not only the inclusion of labor, but also its formal exclusion. And what that would result in is this unimaginable violence. Well, the truth is people could imagine it, and it became part of a tradition. And so what this does is it brings this 100-year time period to a close, because in 1943, that's when that original 1882 law becomes repealed by Congress. So again, 1840s, the recruitment of Chinese to Placer County. 1940s is when that exclusion law finally is repealed. But you could see what that does, what kind of damage that does to several of these communities. How do any of these communities see themselves fully as human? How can they understand the safety of what it means to build a community, to own land, to become a doctor, or to get an education? What this does is it actually ends in a bittersweet way, because it's the new generations, the children and grandchildren of that original set of pioneers, who end up inspiring a new generation to take hold with their activism. And so if we fast forward from this time period, excuse me, let's fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, there's a new generation, second and third, and even fourth and fifth generations of Chinese, Japanese, South Asian, and Filipinos and others, who find themselves in the 1960s and 70s paying attention to the newest challenges of their lives. They're taking a look at what Chinatowns and Japantowns and Manila towns look like in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Honolulu. And what they're finding is that they are opposing a war in Southeast Asia. They're finding that their parents and grandparents have stories that have never really been told. And so they take it upon themselves in the creation of an Asian American movement of the 1960s and 70s. They take it upon themselves to start creating these histories. They're paying attention to not only their aspirations, but they're also banding together in a way that had not been possible in prior generations, not in a mass way. They see each other as part of an Asian American movement. And they were very intentional at this time period in terms of thinking about that term. Yes, they saw themselves as Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and other, Korean American and South Asian and other. But they also saw themselves in this new term. The way that we refer to ourselves in the present as Asian Americans is a debt that we owe to this time period, this group of people who saw themselves across those ethnic lines. And what they did was they emphasized an ethic that we can think of in terms of solidarity. So if we think about what are the traditions of the Asian American movement and of Asian American culture, it really comes down to these two aspects of solidarity and resistance. I just want to highlight three pioneers who've been with us in the field. Only one is still with us presently, but the other two I think you should know about, and there are certainly more. And like I said, it's more than just an onion where you can keep peeling these layers. There are so many more aunties and uncles and lolas and lolos to get to know because they've been here before, working and organizing. From the left to the right, we have Grace Lee Boggs, who was born in 1915, passed away in 2015. Got a PhD in philosophy. She was an organizer in Detroit and worked with her African-American husband, Jimmy Boggs, on many social movements in the Midwest. In the middle here, you have Yuri Kochiyama, who passed away in 2014. She was born in 1921, who was organizing with Malcolm X right up until his death. In fact, she's part of that celebrated photo of cradling Malcolm just on the very last day of his life. She was organizing in New York City with African Americans and with a young Asian American movement. Nobuko Miyamoto, who is a wonderful personal friend, born in 1939, would dance on Broadway and became a fantastic artist in her own right. Also became an elder in the field of creating Asian American music, specific songs that would pay attention to the dreams and the hopes of a prior generation. So I look at these three, and it's just these three that we could start with, but all of them have lived out what the terms of what solidarity means, to think about one's journey and one's struggle by seeing it in others, in Latinos, in other Asian Americans, and certainly in African Americans, and of course in indigenous people as well. These are three fantastic examples whose biographies tell us what solidarity looks like from the perspective of Asian Americans. Each of them have written biographies and memoirs, so I would suggest you follow up on that. And I could certainly put their names in the chat if you'd like to learn more. Right up to the present, solidarity is not the same thing as resistance, but resistance is ongoing, and we still have to look back to that time period, just as the people who are holding up that banner in San Francisco, Chinatown in 2020, they're looking back to a very durable and persistent attitude concerning Asian America. And what I want to do is to end my talk here by thinking about what resistance is and solidarity has been. These are foundational to the identity of what it means to be Asian American. Because in every generation, from the 1882 Exclusion Act to the 1934 Exclusion Acts, all of these communities have been resisting forces against that have called for their exclusion, right up to the very present. There's nothing new to Asian American resistance. This is the tradition. That's the tradition of Asian America, is resistance and solidarity. I want to close here with this one thought about this notion of a model minority. I know a lot of us like to think about the idea that Asian Americans are persisting under this idea that we are a model minority. And what I'd like to do is to challenge all of us to actually resist it, to see it as a myth, to see it as a trap, because this idea of a docile or a passive or a quiet Asian American, to me, doesn't square with history. And I am an observer, I'm a student, I'm a scholar of this history. And I'm also the son of a Filipina. I'm the husband to an Asian American woman. And personally, historically, I would never say that Asian Americans are quiet people. So I don't know why we continue to subscribe to the idea that Asian Americans see themselves or subscribe to the idea of passivity or quietness. In every historical time period, in every locale that we've been in, from strike to strike, we have been very loud and demanding in who we are. That's different from studying for your MCAT, right? That's different for studying for your LSAT. You want to put your head down and take care of business, take care of business. But if you want to understand the legacy of Asian America, you want to think about Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, you want to think about Nobuko Miyamoto, you have to think about the loudest people that you've ever heard in your life. Those are these aunties and uncles, and they will not stop sharing their voices. They will not stop screaming their histories from these mountaintops. So I want to share that as hopefully a way to reorient ourselves around this idea of what a model minority is, and resist the idea of this passivity and quietness, because this is the tradition. This is the legacy of Asian America. So thank you for sharing your time with me. I hope we can get into a dialogue and field some questions. I'd love to hear your comments. And again, thank you for this opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Theo. That was amazing. I think it's so important for us to just frame our series starting with the history. And that's why we wanted to start the series on this topic, because it's a history that isn't taught very often. I know myself growing up in the US was never taught this history. And so it's so important for us to frame what's going on today around what's already happened before us. So just to introduce myself, my name is Arum Lee Lansell. I oversee learning and development and diversity, equity, and inclusion at General Catalyst. I'm so honored to be here with Theo and with all of you listening in. So we do want to get to audience questions, so please do submit it through Q&A. The first question actually is just right off of one of your last slides there, is that we have an upcoming session in this series all around the model minority myth. And so I wonder if you could just take some time to explain for people who haven't heard that term before, what does that mean and why did it come into kind of popular thought that Asian Americans are model minorities?
Yeah, well, in the years after World War II, there were interesting articles about Asian American communities, and I'm thinking of one in particular that summarized the life of Japanese American communities a generation after World War II. So the idea was really to think about what happened to Japanese Americans after such a horrific event. The incarceration of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans in camps, concentration camps around the country, and after that blighted history, just one generation later, this reporter, I believe it was in the New York Times, or it might have been San Francisco Chronicle, this reporter had pointed to the experiences of Japanese American valedictorians in schools. And it was really quite celebratory. The idea is like, look, one generation, just within one generation after a massive civil rights abuse to 120,000 people. And here you have young Japanese American kids that are now reaching the top of their graduating classes. Isn't that a fantastic achievement? And so what it did was it left a legacy then to then be applied to other Asian Americans. So not only then what happens is it becomes universalized, where it's not just the experience of Japanese Americans, but then all throughout the 1980s, you have a lot of magazine articles and other specials that are pointing to this idea of high achievement of Asian Americans, Chinese and Japanese Americans, Korean Americans in particular. Now, on the one hand, it's great to be able to celebrate the achievements of these valedictorians and high achievers. But what it also does is that there's the kind of a backhanded legacy of this, which is then it shows while some people are great at what they're doing, it then also then pathologizes other racial minorities. And it holds Asian Americans up as a standard to which others are not holding themselves up. And so it becomes really pernicious. And what it ends up becoming is a way to divide communities and to assign some really nasty pathological thinking about this other question. Why aren't these other communities, why can't they get their act together? And for those that are involved in solidarity work, for those that are involved in just wanting to build a sense of community, one of the things you don't want to do is to be able to see your achievements as being held up as a standard for which others are falling down on. And so it becomes not only unfair, what it does is within the community, it also underemphasizes the disparities within various groups. And so if we take a look and we kind of disaggregate the data of the Asian American experience, we'll find that there are communities, even within Asian American communities, that are not living in the same places. They don't have access to the same kinds of healthcare, housing, education. And what it does is also ends up underemphasizing and not telling the story of Pacific Islanders, for example, of Southeast Asians, of refugees, who are facing very different kinds of circumstances and need a specific kind of attention to what they're going through. The model minority thesis doesn't apply to an entire group, and it cannot. And so I think we have to look back on not only the origins of it, see the pernicious ways that it's been used to divide us against other racial minorities, but also understand that it doesn't tell fully the story of who we are. And that's really one of the main challenges. Whenever we're trying to talk about Asian American and Pacific Islander experiences, we have to insist on the fullness of who we are, not just the achievements, not just the high incomes and the material success of what we've been able to achieve. We have to understand the people who are in need of the most, who need connection, and hopefully how we can stay connected to them. And so that tells the fullness of our humanity. So whether it's thinking about social services or even just media representations, why are we allowing ourselves not to be fully represented when we talk about this term Asian American and Pacific Islander?
And speaking on the fullness of experiences, you talk about how there are different experiences within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And that's one of the questions that just came in is, how do different groups such as South Asians fit in the broader story of Asian American history? And I'll extend that also to, Pacific Islanders and Southeast Asians. Like, they're all very unique experiences that that we need to honor those differences and yet have that solidarity.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, especially when we're thinking about South Asian histories, it is both, the arc of that is historically long, but if we think about not only just the United States, and if we pull our perspective to the hemisphere, then we're really thinking about the idea of South Asian labor coming to the Americas, North and South America and the Caribbean, as early as the 1800s. I mean, we're really talking about Chinese labor from China and South Asia, particularly India, coming in the 1800s, the early 1800s, as replacement labor to African Americans. So when we, again, this is global history, and I know it's kind of a shame that when we think about history, it's so boring. I don't see it as boring. I find this incredibly fascinating because it allows us to link ourselves to each other in ways that were not possible in those history classes when I was a high school student. We have to think about the formal end of slavery in the 1800s of African persons, 1806 especially. Again, when that form of labor is no longer legal in the 1800s, capital turned to other sources in Asia and in South Asia for recruitment. And that's how we get actually thousands of South Asian labor coming to Guyana, coming to South America, coming to the Caribbean, Chinese labor coming to Cuba, coming to South America, coming to North America as well, to the point now where we have South Asian as well as Chinese labor speaking Spanish and French in all of these interesting locales in the Americas. And so that's why I think, sometimes America is not enough, if you take my meaning, right? It's not just to study United States history. We have to be attuned to the global flows of how we've been here. And the truth is, we have to think about the early importing of Asian labor, and a lot of it was referred to as coolie labor. And the odd thing is that it was referred to as coolie labor not only in India but also in China. And so what does that leave us with? I think one of the things that it leaves us with is that structurally, our histories are linked to the fate of African and African Americans. Structurally, we're linked to a time period in the 1800s that is much earlier than what we think about usually when we think about Asian importation or Asian communities after 1965. So in that sense, it allows us also to think about not just the United States, but this whole hemisphere of how Asian faces and body and labor has transformed the Americas for centuries now. That to me is a really important lesson. And then again, we have to consider what that movement did in the 1960s to redefine who was an Asian American. And we're still trying to refine what that means. I mean, that's the term that we have, but when we consider, again, the contributions of South Asian labor, it goes back that far. And of course, we have a lot of work to do. So I'm glad that the person asked that.
Have you seen the demographics, changing a lot within the AAPI community in the recent years, and how has that influenced the fight for Asian equity, the changing demographics?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, I think, one of the interesting and surprising questions over the last 20 years, and why the U.S. Census matters, because it provides us with a really tangible snapshot as to where our communities are. And if you look at the 2000, 2010, and now the 2020 census, I think what people will find are the legacy communities, if you will, anchored around New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Honolulu, of course, where the largest communities are. And a lot of that is because of the histories I've been talking about, the recruitment of Asian labor to those coasts and the territory of Hawaii. So it's kind of undeniable. We still are paying attention to that in major ways because that's where the communities have been. It's the oldest Chinatown in North America is in San Francisco. Okay, so no disrespect to New York Chinatown. Love that as well. But one was there a little bit earlier, but that's neither here nor there. I think what we'll find, especially after 1965, with the changing of immigration laws, but especially in the 2000s, 2010, 2020 census, I think what you'll find are suburban communities that are very well outside of those Chinatowns of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. What you'll find are very large communities in New Jersey, here in what's called the DMV, the District of Maryland, District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. Very large South Asian and Korean populations in Annandale and Arlington and the rest. And also we'll find is massive growth of an Asian American community in the South. I'm talking about Houston. I'm talking about New Orleans, also with Atlanta. So if we can just kind of put together a couple of news items within the past year, the horrific shootings in Atlanta of mostly Korean American women, it kind of comes out of the blue for a lot of people, but one of the things that was frustrating to see was the media coverage not paying attention to the fact that Asian populations have moved there in large numbers over the last 20 years, which helps to explain why there are so many Korean Americans as well in those surrounding neighborhoods of Cobb County and the rest. So when my colleagues at the Smithsonian and I are thinking about teacher training modules, there are educators in Cobb County that want to pay attention to Asian American history. So again, we rarely get calls from San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York to kind of think about teacher education and training. It's coming from places like Houston, Harris County. It's coming from places like Cobb County outside of Atlanta, because that's where this incredible growth, some cases 30, 40, 50%, 80% growth from decade to decade. And I think people would be surprised by that. There is a large Hmong population that's been in North Carolina for several years now, not only the ones that we know about in Madison. So this idea of thinking about where Asian Americans are, I mean, really the question is, where are we not?
Mm-hmm. Working in DEI, I occasionally hear this idea or question of, are Asian Americans also considered people of color, which often surprises me, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, why that even comes into as a question, even from Asian Americans themselves, and what the response is.
Yeah, That is a great question. You know, I don't know if there's a conclusive answer to this. I think what it does is it reveals that the way that we want to be connected to each other, those terms continue to be negotiated. And the idea is that it's reflecting a demographic change in the United States where the majority of the population is going to be non-white anytime soon. I mean, you know, it's if as a whole it'll be something like 2030. You know, in some communities, it's been that way for the last 20 years. So I mean, I finished my PhD at Irvine, and you could look into many of these campuses in the area of Riverside and Santa Barbara, San Diego, and Irvine. It's been majority Asian American for many years now. So the question is, where are you talking about? How we talk to each other as people of color or not? I mean, that's a shifting target. That's a negotiation. Sometimes that comes as a result of where we've been globally. I'll share with you one anecdote that goes back to 1954 and 1955. Richard Wright, the African-American writer, was sitting in his apartment in Paris. He saw news of this conference that was going to take place in Bandung, Indonesia. And he thought, well, this is interesting. About 19 countries are going to be represented, none of which involve the Soviet Union or the United States. And it focused on the countries of Asia and Africa. And he was really quite intrigued by that because he added up the numbers. So back of a napkin edition led him to understand that the majority of the world's population was going to be represented in this one conference. The majority of the world's population between Africa and Asia. So Richard Wright, as someone who had been dissatisfied by America's racism and its treatment toward him as a Black man and as an artist, packed up his bags and decided he wanted to go to be a reporter because he thought the world's majority is speaking. And it was African and it was Asian. And these were people from Sri Lanka, Ceylon, the Philippines, other African nations. And so he wanted to see the world speak to each other in new ways. And again, this is when the third world was equated with possibility and not just simply corruption or death and disease and poverty. The third world at that point had a different message for people like Richard Wright. It meant that you were part of the global majority, and to act in that way was to act with a sense of confidence and purpose. So, you know, however we talk to each other as people of color or BIPOC or the rest, I mean, these are negotiations that we have about how to be connected to each other, which I think is ultimately the real goal, which is to understand ourselves and our place in the world. So I try not to get hung up on the terms. I'm happy to be corrected if people wish to be referred to in a certain way, but I see it in that way, in the way that Richard Wright had, which was one of great anticipation of how to be connected to the world that's trying to speak to me, because I want to be able to speak to it as well.
I love that idea of saying, you know, part of the global majority, as opposed to, you know, thinking of yourselves always as a minority. One final question for you is, do you see anything now that gives you hope that real change is coming for the future?
That's really tough, Arun.
That's really hard to say no to, right? No, there's nothing that gives us hope.
When we get a chance to be in each other's company like this, when we can share these histories honestly, when we can have a chance to be with each other more than 200 characters at a time and longer than a 10-second video clip, then hopefully we'll learn more about each other that is deeper and grander than anything that we originally expected. So I'm hoping that that's the case. I'm inspired by the example of Christina Wong and her group of what they refer to as the anti-sewing squad. So in the middle of the pandemic, you know, initially there was that lack of PPE that people needed so drastically in so many hospitals, personal protective equipment. And so Christina Wong, a Chinese American comedian, an Asian American comedian, decided to put together her group of other aunties, mostly Asians, with sewing machines and whether elastic bands and whatever cloths that they had, because she understood that Asian aunties get things done. And where there had been a crisis of a supply chain, she wasn't interested in hearing about anyone else's excuses about the failure to address that moment. She turned to this very old tradition of dealing with Asian aunties, because Asian aunties know how to do this. They know how to get this done, and they organized hundreds of sewing circles to get together thousands of these PPE. And to me, that's the ethic of being able to stay connected, to rely on a tradition of care, of watching out for each other, and not waiting to rely on other people to solve the crisis. How do you respond to the crisis? That's how they did it. The Auntie Sewing Squad did it. So I'm grateful that there are people who rose to the moment, because that's what's required, especially at this time. So I hope all of us can stay connected and be inspired by that example.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's what gives me hope. Just seeing those examples, just humanity, as Molly mentioned at the beginning, is just people coming together to do what they can to better the world, better the situation. Thank you, Theo. This was really wonderful. I do want to tell the audience that our series will be continuing. So the next session in this series is in late June. We're really going to be focused more on honoring and celebrating the different identities and experiences within the AAPI community. As we already talked about, there are so many different experiences, and we want to talk about some of those differences while also understanding how we come together in solidarity and in that resistance that Theo talked about. The third session will continue in September after kind of the summer break. And the third session will be diving more into the model minority myth. So again, what it means, but also how it has personally affected leaders in tech and in VC, in these industries that we work in. And then the final session in October, we'll come back to Theo, and he will be interviewing Helen Zia, an amazing activist, amazing fighter for Asian equity. So we'll really enjoy that conversation. So we hope that you'll come back and join us for the rest of this series. Thank you again, Theo. Thank you, Molly. And thank you all, to all of you for joining us.